years ago. I mean, that's a judgment call on my part, but you check it out for yourself. I mean, honestly, and without prejudice, take a look around. You say, well, my personal relationship with my spouse is worse off than it was 3 years ago. Yeah. In other words, there we go with attitudinal changes. Measure those things, but then really look. Who are you right now compared to who were you? Were you the quiet subordinate of the relationship of 3 or 4 or 5 years ago? And yes, it might very well be more chaotic at the moment for a Tom and Elaine or anybody else or yourself or people that you know. But generally, are you better off with more facilities in your brain and in your mind and in your spirituality to start recognizing who you can be, who you wish to be, who you need to be in regarding some of these chaotic changes and so on. And that's what's known as attitude. And even though the immediate result of an attitudinal change might be chaotic or negative or bad or the OG situation, that is the flowing and often very chaotic changes, the earth changes that I've been looking forward to, that I've been actually sometimes secretly preaching about and so on. And we're part of this right now. We have the ability with love and with attitude to override, and I'll even use the word annihilate, negative forces, armies, and I mean, should we dare prematurely point the finger at Czechoslovakia? Look at what is taking place there. This is not just a revolt. This is not just civil unrest and demands, and therefore 1 or 2 public officials are saying, whoa, I better get out of here before I get hanged or killed or overthrown. No, these are attitudinal changes on the part of a lot of these officials. Socialism and communism and so on, and even democracy. There's in Latin America and South America and so on. You're going to have the arrogance of some of the leaders down there who are simply militaristic and power people and say, no, I will stay in office no matter what because this is mine. There's the attitude. And you or I or collectively, we may not be able to reach that person in a loving gesture, and they may need to be physically overthrown or thrown out. But take a look at the effect of the last 6 months or the last year regarding the degree of change and the permanent type changes that have taken place, which, is so much easier, quicker, faster, better, with an attitudinal change that is very shocking. Am I just babbling on? To me, it's the events of the last couple of months in the very last part of '89. As a matter of fact, in a similar, so the subject that we're on, just this last night, I happened to open the book Heading Toward Omega, which I really should read sometime. And a friend of mine was pointing something out that, well, Tom, here's some statements of near-death experiencers back in, and then he looked at the date of the book, and he says, well, the book was published in as late as '84. And I said, well, I think that it was written in 1982. So he says, all right, well, 82, 84, he says, back a few years. And he says, and the statements in here, most of this book is actually outdated because it's saying things like, yeah, I can see a great deal of chaos and attitudinal changes which will take place by the end of 1989. And I got a little emotional, but then I laughed. And I said, oh, yeah, I can remember saying that. And, many of you who listen to this tape, you might have a copy of that book. And I'm saying that the book is pretty well out of date. Practically everything in that book, especially when it came to the psychic aspect and so on, it talked about the onset of nuclear war. There's many phrases and paragraphs in there that for the purposes of confidentiality, and if you can possibly perceive that in 1982 there were attitudes and fears, subtle fears of myself and many other people who were written about in that book that said, yes, Ken, you can use this information, but you can't use my name. You can't identify me with these particular quotes. The Kodak syndrome was talked about. And I'm saying this now, and you can read in the book, and you'll hear where it says, I don't even know if it identifies Rochester, but here's where in a major industry, there was a factory where there was some death and destruction going on, and how that a near-death experiencer was able to accomplish change of positive nature and save people's lives without getting anyone fired. I mean, oh yeah, you can say, wow, neat, that was clever, but it was done by changing the attitudes of the people, not by saying, hey, you're doing something immoral or illegal or wrong. It was just approaching these people either directly or indirectly, saying, we're making a profit and you're making a good product, but can we improve on the atmosphere around these people in those subtle ways like that? You can read in that book, and it's really kind of a good history, because many of those things were dated and said, and there was another quote which I can't say right now, I'll be too emotional about it, but you'll be able to read that book now and hear me in that book. You pretty much identify with the majority of those quotations were from Tom Sawyer's near-death experience and precognitive stuff, including mention of a nuclear detonation in the Middle East. And I didn't realize, last night I read this one little paragraph, and I didn't realize the number of details that spelled out the precognitive nuclear detonation in Tyre, Lebanon. I don't believe I said Lebanon, but I did say the Middle East. And of course, I was dealing with, when was this? And of course, that famous statement that Ken Ring tried to give me, purposely give me the wrong date so that I would say, oh no, and correct him and give the correct date. And the way I answered him was, he said, well, in other words, it will be in, say, the summer of 1991. And my immediate reaction was, oh no, it has to be an Olympic year. And then over the next several years, realizing, wait a minute, there are a couple of Olympic years between 1982 and 1988. And then, of course, it zeroed in on. And by the way, just for the record, that what a funny phrase, a deadline. But the deadline for that particular event was to have been, it's precognitively, and it's almost a contradiction of terms, but precognitively, there was to have been that nuclear detonation by August 15th of 1988, which was not that long ago, a little over a year ago now. And with attitudes and so on, yes, we changed that. Now, there's something where the attitudes to and toward and regarding the military were necessary, but in fact, that was a circumstance where I could not do anything about it. Like, I didn't go there and disconnect it. That certain special forces of the military were necessary to actually end up facilitating that. But it was brought on by attitudinal changes within the Pentagon saying, what's a near-death experience? And then eventually having certain individuals become interested in it and deriving some direct information, be it psychic or precognitive, from a near-death experiencer, and then many near-death experiencers. I don't by any means want anybody to think that it was a Tom Sawyer situation or that I did this. This was a collective effort, and that I might have assisted and participated with, say, locating the actual warehouse in Tyre, Lebanon, or Sur, Lebanon, and then somebody else was more accurate in pinpointing the time frame, and with assistance of all of us collectively, by way of conferences and so on, and just sharing and, actually very bluntly loving one another, that collectively we were able to muster enough information to convince the military that this was not only feasible, but this was to be. And it did go to the 11th hour, but it was facilitated. And it was facilitated not by these weird or fancy schmancy by title near-death experiencers or people who've had a very profound, spontaneous spiritual awakening, but it was facilitated with the assistance of, minimum, with the assistance of people with a more positive attitude.
Tom, if the military had gotten involved on some level, in a way, I don't know how much they really did. I mean, they did in terms of finding and dismantling everything. But if at a certain point they'd gotten in the way of the prayers of the attitudinal change, then that man wouldn't have had the opportunity to have that spontaneous awakening. You know, I don't know if that makes.
Yeah, I didn't quite understand. Were you actually asking a question, or?
Yeah, you had said that somehow having some kind of a connection to the Pentagon or whatever, and I thought that it almost didn't have any connection through any of the military powers on either side other than the power of prayer. I mean, it was like...
Right now, specifically, are you talking about the nuclear detonation?
Right.
All right, because, well...
Or you're talking about the attitudes of people in military power changing.
Well, no, I was trying to incorporate that. Please don't get unrealistic about what I'm talking about, because attitudinal changes are a necessity right now for the survival of mankind. Our general attitudes are not good enough. I mean, I'm not pointing the finger at anybody, but collectively, our general attitudes are that here we are on this earth, and it's ours, and we can do whatever we want with it. And we waste, we are, there's all that stuff, and that's no longer acceptable. Mother Earth has put up with us, especially for the last 100 to 200 years, where we have had the potential for destroying or killing or hurting her, meaning Mother Earth, and that we have the potential for annihilating that which we need to survive. In other words, our house, if you will. By our house, I'm talking about the Mother Earth, the little blue marble that we live on. And we have the potential for annihilating that. And our attitudes are the basic measurement for survival or annihilation. And if we lose our general attitudes, if we degrade our attitudes and so on, I'm saying that within the next couple of generations, the human condition is going to be annihilated. I mean, so let's stop fooling around. This is a fact. You can look at it scientifically, ecologically, spiritually, and most importantly, by my standards, is realistically. This is not a joke. This is not a new age phenomenon or anything else. This is simple fact, and that it's not just a nice thing, and you might feel more pleasant knowing that you'd help somebody out in the Middle East. I mean, knock it off. This is for ourselves. This is for our survival. And it's not something that's nice to do, and I wish for everybody to try it. This is beyond that. This is a necessity. And there are going to be those people, Noriega. I mean, I don't want to point the finger, but an attitudinal person like Noriega might have to be physically picked up and slammed down. I mean, and if this one person, and this one person's attitude is in the way of our survival, he may have to be annihilated. I mean, I'm not by any means advocating killing or anything else, but by annihilation.
Of power.
Right. I mean, nothing should stand in the way of the realistic and compassionate survival of the big blue marble of our lives, of our existence.
In thinking about a person that's in a power like that, I know even on an everyday basis, bringing it right down into our own life, if we have somebody close to us in our life that every time we look at them, we go, that's a bad person. That's a person with a bad attitude. I hate that person. And they get sort of hate bombed instead of love bombed, or you just expect whenever you meet this person that they're going to be mean or negative or whatever. You give power to the negativity.
Yeah.
So if we're looking at a Noriega or a Qaddafi or whatever, and I always remember that quote from Eileen Caddy and Finhorn of expect the most wonderful things to happen. To expect that through prayer or through love gestures or through whatever, that a person's whole attitude, whether it's your next door neighbor or your husband or wife or somebody in power on the other side of the world, can have a real positive, loving turnaround instead of always expecting the worst of whatever comes into your
Right.
life.
It's true what you said. And Lynn, remind me, because you know how I get off on tangents. I want to make sure that I say something in just a minute about the disproportionate effect of hate bombing versus love bombing. In other words, there is a reality, there is a potentiality to both, but it is disproportionate, thank God. All right. But what I want to say is there are many examples of actualities, in other words, realities and actualities, of our ability to love unconditionally. In other words, regardless of who you are, regardless of the justification and the righteousness of saying, well, that's my husband or that's my wife, or that's only my husband or that's my wife, or how can you possibly ever justify going to a Catholic church, paying $25 and saying, with this $25, you have advertised that I can have 3 masses said for 3 people, or 3 masses said for an individual. And I personally did that and chose a mass be said for Dr. Charles Flynn, for Father Dennis Bonsignor, and for Adolf Hitler. And the priest wrote down on the card for me, filled it out, and he stopped when he started to make the A of Adolf Hitler. And he looked at me and, of course, was realistically saying, you know, are you making a joke? Are you out of your mind? What is the story? And one of the last things that he did think of right away was how absolutely unconditional and lovely, and are you being fervently honest? And I really convinced him that, no, this is my desire. And I said, I know that most people would immediately cringe and say, you cannot love that which is so sinister as an individual who, through free will and manipulation and so on, is directly or indirectly responsible for the death and destructions of millions of people and the suffering of many, many, many millions more. And I said, but, you know, why are we here and what are we doing and what are we trying to overcome? One of the things that I was trying to overcome was this attitude of, well, let me give you the worst example. What about Adolf Hitler? Well, God bless him, please. In other words, he's deceased. It was by way of suicide. Is there anybody, any deceased entity, if you believe in souls, departed souls possibly being in a hellish or purgatory scenario? I mean, if we compassionately can turn that unfortunate, horrendous, negative, bad scenario and situation, therefore focus on the individual, he, the deceased entity, Adolf Hitler, and can upgrade that, where are we? Well, among other things, we'll be a hell of a lot, no, that's not a good phrase, be, you know, a lot better off. And I was being honest, and the priest very hesitantly allowed that to be said. In other words, allowed the mass to be said for the spirituality of Adolf Hitler. I mean, that's like the, you know, was I being cute? Was I being manipulative? Was I just doing something to teach a lesson to that priest? In all of his reverence and so on, but his normal, realistic attitude that, well, you say masses for your grandmothers and stuff. You don't say masses for Adolf Hitler. I mean, he's already gone. And, you know.
Yeah, I remember you saying, Mother Teresa doesn't need your prayers, Adolf Hitler does.
Yeah, well, and again, I didn't actually mean that literally.
Yes.
Because, see, that attitude is wrong, but it's a way of shocking, you know, what is your attitude? And you say, well, if you had $25, you should give it to Mother Teresa, or say a prayer for Mother Teresa. God bless her. Isn't she wonderful? La-di-da. And there's 2 ways of looking at it. Yes, you should. You pray for the enhancement of that which is positive in nature. And you want to participate in that. You want to promote and enhance that. but you should not ignore the one in most need. And it might very well be yourself. I then talked with that priest for about an hour, and I said, well, now that you know that I'm being honest in what some of my attitudes are, I said, I'm not about to do this because of my cultural conditioning and so on, but can you see that my philosophy tells me that I might very well wish for my prayers to be said for me? And I said, not that I'm going to cover my own ass and have a whole stack of prayers, the scorecard, so that when I'm deceased and so on, that I've got a couple sergeant stripes on my sleeve already waiting for me. No, but very realistically, that's not unrealistic. And it depends on my attitude at the time. In other words, if I'm being arrogant and saying, well, I know how to pray better than you, and therefore, watch this, I'm going to pray for, there's no other explanation necessary. I mean, I might even be harmed by doing that, or in other words, in some way, at least spiritually, that I would pay the price for it, that kind of ignorance and arrogance. And, you have to look at things. I said earlier this morning that, jump out of yourself if you can and go to the very highest level and look back at yourself. And one of the measurements to that you're high enough actually doing this, looking at yourself, your situation, or your ability to decide, or your attitude, is that you will laugh. And that laughter may actually be sarcastic, or it may be that adorable laughter, meaning this higher person looking down at this infant or this ignorance, and that we have a tendency sometimes to laugh at that lovingly. All right, and if you accomplish that and you start laughing at yourself, well, then that simply tells you that you've reached a high enough level. So just use that, make the observation of outside yourself, looking back at yourself, and then go back to whatever normal is, or wherever you are at that moment, and then try to go more subtle than that. I don't like to say lower, but in other words, that connotation of down or negative, but go lower to yourself. Go to your psychological self, the grassroots level of where is this coming from? Is this a stimulus from my childhood, or is this those grassroots, the very root of the situation? If it be a problem, then you say the root of the problem. If it be, I'm having trouble feeling almost too good all of the time, then say, well, what is that based on? Is that a wish fulfillment? In other words, am I, Tom Sawyer, just still off in some cocky dream world that I have been to the light and I will be in the light again, and this is just a temporary la-di-da, here I am, always smiling? I mean, that can be, you can actually have an incorrect attitude regarding that. I can have an incorrect, that's a judgmental statement. How do you say it without being judgmental? That I can have a distorted attitude regarding myself at any given time. Whew, nice stuff. Oh, by the way, just to round it off, that conversation that I had with Tim, and telling him that attitudes is more powerful than guns. And in other words, he understood it, and he just kind of like looked and shook his head yes. In other words, he was perceiving that which I was trying to tell him and show him, and that he got enough measurements to answer his question. And I was very realistic, saying, no, Tim, the Melchizedek priesthood did not take a hammer and chisel and take the first chunk out of the wall. And I was, no, we didn't do that. How many people were even aware that something like that was available or going on? It doesn't work that way. It doesn't have to work that way. It can very well be, and you may be moved to do something or travel somewhere or go somewhere. I mean, have I had plane tickets in my pocket and not used them, knowing that I'm in a dilemma? I'm not sure if I really should go travel this distance and pay for this ticket and spend this time and money for the purposes of possibly assisting one person. And the one circumstance that I'm remembering right now, where I had the plane ticket in my pocket for 3 weeks in time, there are actually 3 different tickets to the same location, and I did not use those tickets, and I have been very sorry ever since that I did that. In other words, I made a mistake. In hindsight of what took place, I wish that I had. I made a mistake. I didn't give in enough to my intuitive knowledge that I should do this. And I was a little too realistic with Elaine's suggestion that, this is a lot of money, and are you going to be able to ever do this again? Because we don't have enough money to have you jump in the plane and go and hug somebody in another part of the United States. And how much value is that? That was a rationalization. The rationalization. I don't want to